Looks like we are good to go. I'm getting thumbs up all around. You want to be turning over to Ezekiel chapter 40. We're in the final stretch, as they say, with the book of Ezekiel. The final section, at least the way that I've set it up, and I think most folks reading and teaching would probably do in a similar manner. Nothing extraordinary about it. Deal with the vision of the new temple and some of the directions for the people that God gives to Ezekiel. And honestly, the content of these chapters is about as easy to understand as the content in chapters 38 and 39, when we dealt with the prophecy of God from the land of Magog. An interesting feature of this last section is it's all one big vision. Ezekiel is taken up into a vision starting in chapter 40 and goes through to the end of the chapter through that vision. And while that's where the book ends for us, chronologically, and I think we pointed this out several weeks ago, this is actually not the last element of time, or the latest element of time that we're aware of in the book of Ezekiel. Just to give you an illustration of that, I'm supposed to read first. I make myself notes to remind to do that. All right. The first few verses there in chapter 40 of Ezekiel. I'm reading from the New International Version. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th of the month, in the 14th year after the fall of the city, on that very day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he took me there. In visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain, on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. He took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. The man said to me, "Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears and pay attention to everything I'm going to show you. For that is why you've been brought here. Tell the house of Israel everything I see, everything you see." There's a few elements in this first section I just want to point out some of the context and give us an idea of, again, the setting for the vision that he's in. Beginning with the timing element, you see on the screen, 25th year of the exile, okay, the 14th year after the fall of the city. We know we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, that's the big element for them. But this is actually, again, not the latest prophecy that we're aware of that he received. If you think back when we were discussing the prophecies of the destruction for the surrounding nations, for various enemies of Israel over time. In chapter 29, we have, at least within the book, the latest time element that is recorded for us. And it's from 29, verse 17. It reads, "In the 27th year, the first month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me." And that particular prophecy deals with the destruction of Egypt, when it comes in. So, again, it doesn't change anything that we're seeing or understanding or trying to understand from the book, but just to point out that this is not the last element as you read the book of Ezekiel that we come across. He did have a somewhat later prophecy in his ministry, as we know it. All right, so the vision. Notice in verse 2 that wording, "in visions of God, he took me to the land of Israel." So God is providing him with something. He's providing him with the information to see. There was a similar type of experience or wording for us earlier in the study. This is now, I guess, our big quiz question for the day. Remember when this happened to him previously? This idea of being caught up in a vision. You have to have been here the whole time to remember this one. It goes back to the beginning. Say again?
The wheels.
Actually, the wording comes, it's in that same element, but it's a little bit different. It's right after that. Yeah, right after that. So at the very beginning of the book, he has the vision of the glory of God coming down with the wheels and the creatures and the platform, the throne. But it's actually in chapter 8 when this particular kind of wording is used. That was a vision too, please correct. It was too. But in chapter 8, verse 3, we have the same type of presentation for us at least. "The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven in visions of God. He took me back to Jerusalem." So it was that period of time in chapters 8 through 10 when he saw the visions of idolatry. Remember, there are 4 different episodes, or 4 different elements of that particular vision to show that the idolatry of the people. There was the leaders, the priests, the people in general that he saw. And the reason I'm pointing that out is I think it's important to recognize from that experience to this one, what he was seeing wasn't a literal, oh, this was happening. If you were to go back to Jerusalem at that moment in time, you'd see all those things in the temple. No, he was given that to portray the extent of their idolatry. And so as we look in this section, to me it's kind of brought full circle, if you will, and that's just my interpretation, not someone else's reading. But with the vision of the new temple, he saw in chapters 8, 9, and 10, from that idolatry, the glory of the Lord leaving. Okay, God was moving away from his people because of their sin and the necessity for their punishment. And here in chapters 40 through 48, we see God returning to this covenant, bringing it back to their relationship, if you will. So, as we did in that section, as we did last week or tried to, we'll look for the spiritual truths. And what is it, the understanding that we have from this? Because there's, again, this element of this new temple, ripe for speculation. There's a lot of it out there on what this is or where it is, or where it should be. What we'll see is it hasn't existed. And that's one of the things we'll have to deal with the next couple of weeks as we go along. Okay, what about this? Because there's a tremendous amount of detail of this building, tremendous amount of detail. So one of the things we're going to do today, starting today and into our next lesson as well, is look at, okay, what do we have in Scripture? What is he showing Ezekiel? What do we think he's showing? Obviously, we didn't see it. We're trying to use our imagination to get a sense of this. Say, okay, and that means what for us? And that will be our challenge in appreciating, again, the spiritual truths that come from this. Because if you haven't, and I hadn't, I'll be honest, before this lesson, really spent much time kind of thinking through and looking at what he is presented with. It's an amazing structure, or it would be an amazing structure. And doing a little bit of contrast later on of, okay, their previous temples, and okay, there's a clear difference. What are some of the lessons we're trying to get from that? So that's where we're going to be going today, and over the next couple lessons, to get through the content of kind of the literal what is in here, and then looking at the understanding that we get from it. Okay, so what did he see? Back to that verse 2. This vision. In visions of God, he is taken to the mount, and he looks out and sees something that resembles a city with all the buildings and whatnot. And that's one of the first clues. This is really big. Okay, what he's seeing is quite large, and we're going to see from the measurement and the descriptions that are given in quite a lot of detail what it includes. You see, if you pick up in verse 3 of chapter 40, he took me there, and I saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand. Okay. So he's taken in this vision of God to this place to see this what's going to be the temple, quote unquote. The man had a linen cord and measuring rod. And I found a pretty good illustration, someone's idea. Again, this is just someone's idea. Well, what could this look like? Well, maybe something like that. All right, this person that looks like a man in bronze standing in the stairs with the measuring rod and the linen cord. Because again, that's what most of this vision is measuring and showing the descriptions, the dimensions of this place that he's going to be shown. This measuring rod that he has is specifically pointed out for us. It's 6 long cubits. I don't do metric, much less cubits, so I have to, of course, look it up. 10.5 feet. Okay, that's a big stick. This is an extremely way off the wall idea. I have no idea. You know that phrase, wouldn't touch him with a 10.5-foot pole? Actually, it's in that song. I don't know where it comes from. I just made that connection. It's just me and my oddities. 10.5 feet. Okay, that's a long pole. He's going to be using that to provide the measurements of what it looks like. Now, one of the interesting things, again, for me, and I think it's somewhat interesting, because of all the dimensions and the measurements in here, for those that are a bit more artistically inclined, they can come up with, well, what might this look like? And so if you were to just do a search for images of this temple, you'll get an illustration that looks something like your third page there. Or it could look something like that. I put it in the handout because I wasn't sure how well it would translate to the screen. And I'm going to use this, again, this is just someone's rendition, their idea of what this space might look like based on all of these different descriptions and measurements. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's just someone's idea and looking for it. But as you're reading through chapters like this, where it's just measurement after measurement after measurement, it helps me to get a sense of, okay, what might this look like or portray? And so we'll refer back to this a couple of times as we go through to see, try to get some of the understanding of it. And where it begins, there it is. So the outer court of the east gateway, that would be this space right here. He's brought to in his vision to the stairs that lead up into this gateway, into that entrance. And what the book is about, or at least these chapters, not the book, the chapters here, is a description of all this different space and what is filling this space that he's seeing. So, and we're not going to read through all of the measurements and all of the descriptions, okay? Because it's too early for that, and there'd be this mass exodus as we read about this many cubits thick and this many cubits high and all of that. But we do need to get a sampling of it. So we're going to read the first part of the east gateway, if you will, picking up in verse 5 of chapter 40. Verse 5 of chapter 40. And I'm going to just read down through verse 8 to give us a sampling of what these chapters incorporate. I saw a wall completely surrounding the temple area. The length of the measuring rod in man's hand was 6 long cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. He measured the wall. It was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. Remember how tall that pole was? 10.5 feet. Okay, 10.5 feet. Tall, 10.5 feet thick. Okay, it's a big wall. Then he went to the gate facing east. He climbed its steps and measured the threshold of the gate. It was 1 rod deep. The alcoves for the guards were 1 rod long and 1 rod wide, and the projecting walls between the alcoves were 5 cubits thick, and the threshold of the gate next to the portico facing the temple was 1 rod deep. Then he measured the portico of the gateway. It was 8 cubits deep, and its jambs were 2 cubits thick. The portico of the gateway faced the temple. It just rolls off the top. The cubits here, the width there, the breadth. That's what much of the next 2-3 chapters is about. Again, we find the dimensions and descriptions of this structure. Now, in this particular section, okay, verses 5 through 16 of chapter 40, you get the east gateway. And it includes things like the outer wall, as we saw, 10.5 feet high, 10.5 feet thick. The threshold, the guard alcoves, the projecting walls between the alcoves, the portico of the gateway. I've heard that word in my life, portico. Okay, it's not completely unknown to me, but I had realized, what's a portico? I wasn't quite sure, so I looked it up. A portico is a porch leading to the entrance of a building or extended as a colonnade with a roof structure over a walkway and supported by columns and may be enclosed by walls. It was used quite a bit in ancient Greece and has influenced many cultures, according to historians. So verses 10 through 16 give you more details about this gateway and the elements of it. I'm not going to, again, go through all of those. It's a description of the structure. Going back to our illustration, again, this is what he's looking at, or what he's describing, it's being described for us in that red circle area. And that area, that portico, and you can sort of get, again, if we're using our imagination, those columns, the taller structures covering the walkway and whatnot, and the dimensions of it. And it's all portrayed. You break down in verses 10 through 16, it gives us the distance from the entrance to what's known as the outer court, okay, this larger area, 75 feet. Okay. Big structure. And remember from the very beginning of the chapter, so they came to the hut, the mountain, looked out over it, and saw what looked like a city. Okay, this is a big, big element in this vision, or the size of it. Now, looking into the rest of the chapter, and we're not going to read through them. Well, that's interesting if you do it that way. Don't point this at the front. All right, the green circle portrays for us the northern gate. That's in verses 20 through 23. And then in verses 24 through 27, you get to the southern gate, right on the opposite side. And what you read is they're exactly the same. Okay? The measurements are the same. It doesn't go through the same detail with the other 2 gates. in the rest of the verses, but it does portray that these are the same in their dimensions and structure. So the symmetry, the parallelism of the structure in and of itself. You have the east, the south, the north gate. You say, well, where's the west gate? Well, it butts up to a wall and to another structure. There's no way to come into it from behind, and it's the way it's portrayed. So there is no west gate, if you will. So besides the gates, moving to verse 17, we begin to get the description of this outer court area, the lower area. And I'm going to read just a couple of verses from that, picking up in verse 17 of chapter 40. And he brought me into the outer court. There I saw some rooms and a pavement that had been constructed all around the court. There were 30 rooms along the pavement. It abutted the sides of the gateways and was as wide as they were long. This was the lower pavement. So the outer court is that tannish, if you will, area. The darker elements is that lower pavement. So you see a little bit right there. And there's your rooms. There's 10 on each side. 30 in total, positioned on the wall. Verse 19, then he measured the distance from the inside of the lower gateway to the outside of the inner court. It was 100 cubits on the east side as well as on the north. Okay. So from edge to edge, or from the entrance, or from as you walk in from the gateway, from there to the entrance to the inner court, you have 100 cubits. Same dimension east, same dimension north. Again, large structure. 100 cubits is about, again, if I trust those who do the conversions, 175 feet. 175 feet. And again, just to give you a comparison about the size, they put this little graphic down here. Well, an American football field is 100 yards. Okay, 100 yards. This thing is almost, it's a little bit over twice the size of a football field. Okay, all the way around. Okay, give you some visual of what it's looking like. Okay. I know thrilling, isn't this? Dimensions and descriptions. That's what Ezekiel got. Okay? And he got to go around in the vision with the man, measuring this with the rod and with the cord. I agonized for a few weeks. Okay, what are we going to do with all these? How do we present these? It's like, this is the best I got. We're just going to overview it and outline it for you, and then come back, okay, what do we do with this? But it's given to us, so I think it's important to pay attention to what's in it. Okay, and look at those elements of it. So that's what we're doing. All right, so beginning in verse 28 of chapter 40, we get to the gates to the inner court. They're described in verses 28 through 37, and then they're broken up again by the south gate, the east gate, the north gate. And these are all, again, I don't have the picture, we'll look at it in a minute, going to the inner court. Okay, so it's a smaller area. And within the inner court is where we're going to find the temple structure. That's where the temple in and of itself is positioned. Okay, so let's look at a description, picking up in verse 28 of chapter 40. Then he brought me into the inner court through the south gate, and he measured the south gate. It had the same measurements as the others. Its alcoves, its projecting walls, and its portico had the same measurements as the others. The gateway and its porticos had openings all around. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. The porticos of the gateways around the inner court were 25 cubits wide and 5 cubits deep. Its portico faced the outer court. Palm trees decorated its jambs, and 8 steps led up to it. And as you can see on the screen, we have the description for the east and the north gate, and the rest of the verses, 32 through 37. Point just take away, these all had the same dimensions as the outer gates. Okay, so you have the 3 on the outside, now you have the 3 on the inner gates going into the inner court. They're all the same. These rather large structures. And again, visually, looks about the same. Come back, you've got the east, the south, and the north. Okay. Directly opposite, there are parallels on the outer court area, and then out to the exterior wall. From the inner gates, okay, as he's continuing to describe, they're measuring again this structure, the dimensions and providing the descriptions, coming from out to in. As they go through the inner courts, they're going to get as they go through the gates to the inner court, they will come to then some of the rooms which are described and beginning in verse 38 of chapter 40, as the rooms for preparing sacrifices. The rooms for preparing sacrifices. Let's pick up in verse 38 of chapter 40. A room with a doorway was by the portico in each of the inner gateways, where the burnt offerings were washed. In the portico of the gateway were 2 tables on each side, on which the burnt offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings were slaughtered. On the outside wall of the portico of the gateway, near the steps at the entrance to the north gateway, were 2 tables, and on the other side of the steps were 2 tables. So there were 4 tables on one side of the gateway and 4 on the other. 8 tables in all, on which the sacrifices were slaughtered. There were also 4 tables of dressed stone for the burnt offerings, each a cubit and a half long, a cubit and a half wide, and a cubit high. On them were placed the utensils for slaughtering the burnt offerings and the other sacrifices, and double-pronged hooks, each a handbreadth long, were attached to the wall all around. The tables were for the flesh of the offerings. So based on the scripture, there was a room by each of the inner gateways for washing of the burnt offerings that would have been brought. The exact positioning of these rooms is not really clear from the scripture. So in the illustration you've got in your packet, that's just someone's idea, well, this is where we put them. They're simply stated as being by the portico, so somewhere around that entrance to the inner court. The tables were for slaughtering the burnt offerings, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings. Again, the exact positioning of these is not clear, nor what they were made of, which is interesting because the point is given, or the detail is given, following verse, that there were 4 tables of dressed stone that were used on which, being addressed on which were placed the utensils for slaughtering all the burnt offerings and the other sacrifices. So, I have no idea what they were made of. It really doesn't matter in terms of our understanding, but there were some differences made. Tables for certain functions that they were to use. And in this case, those dressed stone tables as a place for the utensils. And the final element we see in this section, they have the double-pronged hooks attached to the wall all around. If you think back to some of the earlier books in the Old Testament, particularly Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, when they're given descriptions about sacrificial service and worship, these prongs, these hooks are used for stabbing the meat as it goes into the pot, okay, to bring out the priest portion. Again, we're not giving the details, but trying to kind of put together some of the information we have in different parts of the scripture. Okay, so besides these spaces for preparing sacrifices, that's what it comes down to. This would be the area where if they were utilizing it as the sacrifices, as the animals were brought in, the sacrifices would be prepared and utilized or dealt with. Besides these spaces, we see in the next section the rooms for the priests. Let's pick up in verse 44. Outside the inner gate, within the inner court, were 2 rooms, one at the south side of the north gate facing south, and another at the side of the south gate facing north. He said to me, the room facing south is for the priests who have charge of the temple, and the room facing north is for the priests who have charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok, who are the only Levites who may draw near to the Lord to minister before him. Then he measured the court. It was square, 100 cubits long and 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. So as he continues to progress as he goes into the inner court, at the side of the north gate, there is a room. This is for the priests who would have charge of the temple, of its maintenance. Okay? You'll see in just a little bit, we'll look in one of the later chapters, there's ceremonial dress, when they were supposed to change their clothes and wear certain garments, going into the presence of the Lord and coming out, going back to the presence of the people, what they would or would not wear. And then at the south side, there was another room. This would have been for the priest who had charge of the altar, okay, and for its care and maintenance, and making sure that they had all the implements that they needed. The other detail we get from this section is that only the sons of Zadok may draw near to the Lord. Okay, this is one of the priestly line, or one of the families in the priestly line, the Levitical line, and only this group was allowed to minister. We're going to look at that in just a more detail here in just a few seconds. But the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of the dimensions, the inner court, that space, again, if you look on the illustration, inside those inner gates, 100 cubits by 100 cubits, which is again 175 feet by 175 feet. Again, rather large structure when it's all said and done. But the line of Zadok. Anybody remember that person? Richard?
Who is Zadok?
That's what I just asked you. You don't know? Okay, I didn't know either. I had to look it up.
This is completely kind of off the left field here. Where are these priests coming from? They're certainly not Levites.
Yeah, Zadok is. He's not out of left field. We have record of him. Or the scripture has record of him. Yeah. Oh, he's real.
Got out of this line out. I'm assuming it's the Lord someplace back down the line.
Actually, one of the later priestly lines, which we're going to see. So, I'm not sure we paid as much attention in this class to the idea of genealogies in the records. When we study Ezra and Nehemiah, we pay a lot of attention to the genealogies because they're important. On one hand, it dealt with the land. Okay, can you trace your family line back to show whose descendants you are, to know whose land or what portion of the land would be your family's? Okay, very important, very important. We're going to see that again in Ezekiel here in another couple of weeks. The Lord does address in this vision the visions of the land, okay, when there would be the return of the exiles. The other element of it that we see it's important for this, and particularly important for Ezra, is the priestly service. Okay, the priestly service, those that were faithful to God, that tried to perform their duties or responsibilities as they were given, as they were laid out by the Lord, as opposed to priests that were unfaithful or that did what they wanted. Sons of Eli. Yeah, Eli. Hophni and Phinehas. Trivia, you got to try to remember things when you don't read the stories as frequently. Okay, the sons of Eli. Eli was the high priest at the time around just before the birth of Samuel, or when Samuel was born, he came and lived and worked under the tutelage of Eli. Okay. His sons, priests, okay, that performed functions that were actually seen in the scriptures up here in terms of the implements and the spacing, offering the sacrifices. Okay. Well, they were not faithful in the sense of they didn't perform their duties as prescribed. They would take the portions they wanted before putting them through the proper, in this case, the offering portion component of it. They slept with women that came to the temple. So they ultimately put to death for their sins. That family line was ultimately punished as well for the sins of the family. And they had to know who they were, okay, who was faithful. Zadok, as we'll see, was a line through the Levitical priesthood that was faithful, while a lot of the other priests were not. And so God singles out this line for their particular service. So what was happening with these? Let's look over in chapter 44. We're going to jump ahead just a little bit. Because while we came to this, and it's a question, okay, this is Zadok in the line. It's addressed a little bit in chapter 44. And what we see in verses 5 through 23 of chapter 44 is God talking about priests and the service of the priests, and he singles out this line for their service to him. So verse 5 of chapter 44, we're going to read down through verse 23, just so you have a sense of where we're going. The Lord said to me, Son of man, look carefully, listen closely, and give attention to everything I tell you concerning all the regulations regarding the temple of the Lord. Give attention to the entrance of the temple and all the exits of the sanctuary. Say to the rebellious house of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Enough of your detestable practices, O house of Israel. In addition to all your other detestable practices, you brought foreigners uncircumcised in heart and flesh into my sanctuary, desecrating my temple while you offered me food, fat, and blood, and you broke my covenant. Instead of carrying out your duty in regard to my holy things, you put others in charge of my sanctuary. This is what the sovereign Lord says. No foreigner uncircumcised in heart and flesh is to enter my sanctuary, not even the foreigners who live among the Israelites. The Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray and who wandered from me after their idols must bear the consequences of their sin. They may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people and stand before the people and serve them. But because they served them in the presence of their idols and made the house of Israel fall into sin, therefore I have sworn with uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences of their sin, declares the sovereign Lord. They are not to come near to serve me as priests, or to come near any of my holy things or my most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices. Yet I will put them in charge of the duties of the temple and all the work that is to be done in it. But the priests who are Levites and descendants of Zadok, and who faithfully carried out the duties of my sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from me, are to come near to minister before me. They are to stand before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares the sovereign Lord. They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to minister before me and perform my service. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they are to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. They are to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waist. Does this sound familiar to you? You go back and read a description when Moses was given the original instructions of the priests and their duties and what they're supposed to do. We're getting a recap. Okay, so this is nothing new in terms of service to God. Okay, what he had given to the Israelites. Okay, that's a recap. My term, not inscription. Okay, but it's the same form. Okay, and again, he's speaking to them in what they understand, what they know. This was their worship. This was their worship, their service to him. He's given this vision to say there's coming a day when there will be worship again. Now we'll have to work through this whole notion, this new temple and sacrifice. Vision, remember vision, okay, not literal. Okay, but he's talking to them things that they would understand. He's supposed to tell the people again about being brought back. Because remember where they're at, they're in exile. Okay, covenant was broken, punishment. Going to be gone for a while, but then it will be brought back. Okay, not just literally in the sense of yes, exiles will return to the land, and there will be another temple. What the group brought, those returning built, was not this. Okay, we know very clearly from history that they didn't build this thing. Okay, so it's not that, but it's the idea and the images that are associated with symbolism that we'll get into a little bit more. Okay, so picking up again at verse 18. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. When they go out into the inner court, or into the outer court, where the people are, they're to take off the clothes they have been ministering in and are to leave them in the sacred rooms and put on their outer clothes so that they do not desecrate the people by means of their garments. Excuse me, so they do not consecrate the people by means of their garments. Those are two very different words. Very different ideas. Okay. So they do not consecrate the people by means of their garments. They must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their heads trimmed. No priest is to drink wine when he enters the inner court. They must not marry widows or divorced women. They may marry only virgins of Israelite descent or widows of priests. They are to teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the clean and the unclean. Okay. So, this emphasis on who will serve, okay, who will teach the people. Those prior to, we go back to, the reasons why are they in exile? Because of their sins, because of practices that desecrated God's holy place, and desecrated his name or profaned his name. Okay. Some very specific things are pointed out for us. They brought uncircumcised or allowed uncircumcised foreigners into the temple. And they engage in idolatry, which we've seen before and we've talked about in several instances. Okay? So the sin of the people, this time pointing out the sin of the Levites in particular. Again, what they're doing by their actions, they desecrate the temple. They break covenant. Okay, they break covenant. God gave them the directions. This was to be the relationship they would have, how they approached him, how they worshipped him. They chose to do it differently. Or they chose to add in, do what they wanted to. As a consequence, the unfaithful Levites could serve in the temple. They could do the work of the temple space. And we don't talk about this a lot, but if you sort of stop and think about this sacrificial system and its operation, to me it's staggering. Staggering. Just in Jerusalem alone, just that city, the people in that city and surrounding it, much less as you have others from the nation coming into Jerusalem at certain times of the year. All the sacrifices are being done. All the animals are being prepared. Now, there's a lot I don't know about that process. But I'm figuring you've got to bring the live animals in. Okay? So there's a lot of mess just from live animals being in this space. You are killing these animals. Okay? They are drawing the blood out. They are skinning them in order to be able to sacrifice, be able to get to the meat, to get to the fat portions. And very specific details of what they're supposed to do. There's a lot of work just to get to the point where they get to the meat portion or to a fat portion that could then be offered. That goes to the priests inside, into the inner space, if you will, where the altar is going to be. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of upkeep and maintenance in this space. And there's a lot of blood that's got to be taken care of. They sprinkle the blood, but the rest of it's got to go.
And if you've had a chance to smell like bull blood, you got to wonder how often they got to clean the place.
Continually.
Yeah,
Continually.
Blood that sits around gets pretty rancid, you know.
A lot of work. A lot of work has to be done. So they'll be able to work. Oops, sorry about that. They'll be able to work, but they don't draw near to God. Okay. Line of Zadok, they, from Scripture, we're told, they were faithful. Okay. Zadok, his family, in their period, were faithful. So God's saying, this group will continue to serve me and draw near to me if they were to go into the holy place, the most holy place. Of course, only the high priest would have gone into the most holy place. They were the ones who would come near to God.
Chip,
Yep.
it just occurred to me that it's been a very long time, or it will be a very long time, before any descendants of Zadok can return to this service. They're being rewarded because of something that occurred a very long time ago. So it's interesting that the effects that ancestors can have on future generations. And to me, that's a point that all of us need to always consider, is our future descendants.
And I think within that, there's also another important point that we've talked about a couple of times in Ezekiel. You know, God looks at each person in his or her life. So, well, let's talk about ancestry. Okay, this man is faithful in his service to God, but he did something that's very important. He taught his family to be faithful in that service to God, and that faith continued so that ancestry that teaches and conveys and builds that faith that others then take on themselves and continue in right relationship. Because we got to be careful and say, well, he was great, so God benefited them. No, he was good. He taught the rest of them to be faithful. That's an inference, okay? I'm drawing an inference. But I think it's a reasonable inference. Because God says they have been faithful. They will serve.
It's also interesting in just that Zadok was a priest during the time of the tabernacle, not Solomon's temple. He was during the time of David. And so it gives you a sense of the timelessness of this. We're not going back to Solomon's temple. The thing that separated, thus creating the holiness, was God's presence in these places. Not the places themselves. Right. And so you ultimately get us to the God doesn't dwell in temple made with hands. Come out from among them, be separate yourself, be holy as I am holy, which results in the new temple that is the church.
Right.
And so you have this lineage here, this sense of faithfulness and God's faithfulness to his covenant, and that's all he's looking for. He's looking for Zadoks in every generation and not necessarily in that place.
He brings out some important elements that we're looking at God's dealings with his people. Across at least what we recognize as time. But for him, time is irrelevant. He's looking at that faithful service and his relationship with his people. And ultimately, we're getting there, the church, and we are the temple. We're going to be talking about that next couple of weeks. You know, you've got this grand display of a temple. Well, we know God doesn't exist in a physical temple. He never did. So David and Solomon had. You know, am I going to live on the earth? No. But it's the symbolism for us, his presence with us, and now his presence in us, and we as his temple, his church. Go ahead, mention.
There's also, this is going to, I don't mean to sidetrack, but I'm sorry, I didn't go on the sidetrack real quick. In the same narrative where we see David winning victories over everyone and ultimately setting the religious house in order, and Zadok and Abiathar coming into the promise. It said that David defeated Moab and then measured the defeated people. And that's an interesting word, measure, with all the measuring that's going there. And so he measured out 2 lines, one to die and one to live. And so measuring the temple, measuring off his line, has a sense of separating. And so it's a descriptive of holiness as much as it is the physical dimension of something.
Yeah. And that's where John has superseded for 1 second, because you give me the segue I was going to anyway, so it wasn't intended. I think one of the important elements for us to take away from this illustration, or from this description, this discussion, God emphasizing again, it's not a new point, holiness. They desecrated his temple, they profaned his name, they made light of his holiness. He's bringing back these illustrations to show them holiness. There's a difference between the common and the uncommon, the clean and the unclean, the holy and the unholy. We're to be holy. He told the Israelites, we see it in the New Testament because they're referring to it, be holy because I am holy. That didn't start in the New Testament. This is God's point throughout his dealings with his creation. Be as I am. Now there's implications for us in understanding, which what does that mean to be of God? That's where we're going. Okay, John, that's what we're going to get to, not today. Our time running out. But when we get to application elements of understanding this imagery. John, go ahead. I know I've held you back.
Right, I was just going to say that verse 23 there really seems to be, to me anyway, a real concise summary about what is to be taught his people. That's the difference between holy and common, as you've already said. And then show them how to distinguish or discern between unclean and clean. And the fact that he says these are his people means there's a relationship there. There is a relationship. And
Sure.
so we're his people. We're in relationship with him through Christ. And so we have to be able to know right from wrong, and that causes me to make a connection to what he says about the work of the Spirit today, convicting the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment.
Be holy.
And discern right from wrong.
Yep.
Know what's right, know what's wrong.
Fairly simple statements, but we can unpack a lot from it in terms of our life and the examples in our following. Again, our faithfulness. And to come back to the point Jimmy made, the faith that I possess, am I sharing that? And is it passing down? Is this faithfulness to God demonstrated in the home and then without? And then without. I will leave you with one more illustration. We've got like 1 minute left. I've been so lucky the last few weeks. Just time is coming right up. So thank you for your comments and getting me to the point. Just to give you some, I found these again. I find oddities fun. Lee mentioned the tabernacle. Okay, just 2 minutes ago. This was the smallest of their structures, quote unquote, that they used to worship God. Basically, some big tents and an altar and a wash basin. Okay, and you compare Solomon's temple dimensions-wise, and I should have gone back and looked up. I didn't do this for the others. You've got the tabernacle, 150 by 75. This particular illustration doesn't include the others, but you've got Solomon's temple. It doesn't include the post-exile temple, which I thought was interesting. I don't give that one a lot of attention or credit, but it was there too. And then, of course, what will come later in Herod's temple in the time of the New Testament. But then this vision of what Ezekiel's seeing, it's just, again, it's this immense structure. And again, I'm pointing out what we have, but not to place, oh, where's this big building? It's not there. Okay? It's symbolic of God's relationship. Okay? As he brings in his church universal, if I can be a little so bold, that it's coming. His association with his people across time. All right, we'll stop there. We're going to pick up. We'll get into the temple area in the next phase. And then we'll continue on. And then some of the other instructions, like you see in chapter 44, there's more of that and some of the final elements. And so we'll pick up there, not next week, but in 2 weeks. We have a guest speaker next week, so be here for that too. All right, thank you all.